The elicitation technique we were given is scenarios. So we all learned a lot about scenarios in our human-computer interaction class, but for this PowerPoint, I just want to look at scenarios a little more in depth and talk about them more as a testing technique rather than just hypothetical situations. So scenarios are representations of users' interaction with the system. An easier way to think of this definition is kind of just a real-world example of how a system is used. Scenarios are descriptions of users' actions. So when we as programmers look back at the scenarios we put users through, we can study their different steps and actions and see where an error possibly could have occurred and what bugs may need to be fixed. Scenarios can help us see if the user struggles with any design portion of our system, just kind of answering the question, is there something we can do to make the application more usable for them? There are three different types of scenarios. These three types of scenarios are problem scenarios, activity scenarios, and interaction scenarios. So when looking at problem scenarios, these type of scenarios describe problems encountered in performing the user's work. So what went wrong when they were trying to do what they were supposed to be doing. And activity scenarios describe how users perform their daily work. And then interaction scenarios describe how users are interacting with the system. So the next question I kind of want to answer in this PowerPoint is, how do we use scenarios and when do we use scenarios? So scenarios can be used once the initial requirements are collected. So to write a scenario, you need to have a basic understanding of the tasks the system you're creating performs and how the user is involved in the tasks of the system. If we don't know what it is the user is expected to be able to do, then we don't know what scenarios to be testing for. In scenario testing, the tester puts himself in the user's shoes and determines real-world scenarios that can be performed. Bartlett describes the purpose of scenario testing is to test the end-to-end functionality of a software application and ensure the business process and flows are functioning as needed. So what does that mean? Testing the end-to-end functionality of an application means we are testing every situation the user could run into from the time they start using our application to the time they close our application. When using scenarios, we need to choose some portion of our system to test and then create several test cases for each scenario that just represent the user completing the task of this scenario. So for example, assume we have an application that the user needs to log into. And so our scenario would be validating the login page. However, just logging in to our application, there are going to be several different tasks the user could run into. When testing the scenario, we need to check all of these. Did the user enter a valid username and password? If so, what happened? Did what we want to happen happen? If not, something needs to change. Or what if the user forgets his password? There needs to be a way to reset the password on the login page. What if the user enters invalid credentials? Does the system tell them what happened, or just leave the user wondering if his computer froze? Scenarios help us understand if there is something more we need to be adding to our project, and also all the different possible outcomes there could be of a user performing a simple task. So to test these scenarios, we need to think of all those different outcomes that could happen and have the user go through every single one. So that's where just in this simple example, there was 3 different outcomes of just the user trying to log in that we could test for and see if the user understands how to proceed from there, and if we, as the programmers, explain to them what even went wrong.
When it comes to scenario-based elicitation techniques, it is easy to see that it can be very successful. From the research that was performed for this technique, the general attitude toward it was positive. One article was particularly accurate with its description for the benefits of scenario-based elicitation. When trying to figure out better solutions, the end user will already have their fair share of ideas for the final product. This technique is successful because the end users get to speak their concerns. All that needs to happen on the engineering end is to listen and guide the conversation. Scenarios can be simple and user-friendly. All it takes is for someone to say things like, I wish I could do this thing or this thing, in order to make the vision clearer. When the end user gets involved, they generally know what they want. As stated before, the ideas that the end user has can usually be great foundations for great components to an application. While scenario-based elicitation techniques are extremely successful, they do have their downsides. Sometimes it is hard to find good scenarios to model the needs of the end user. If the group or company isn't very enthusiastic in what they think they could be better, you might have to search for use cases from other sources, which can be long and difficult. Not everything will work for this technique either. The success of this technique comes from the ability of the end user to describe the problem and their needs clearly. And if you can't bridge that gap, sometimes it's harder to come to that conclusion. And lastly, it simply cannot cover all the bases for what it takes to improve or rebuild a good product. For example, sometimes you may not have all the pieces that it takes to get to the end product when it's only situational based ideas.
So now that we've kind of learned more about scenarios, we know the pros and cons, we know what scenarios are, and we know how to use them. Now we want to look at when should we use scenarios. Scenarios are useful when the system needs to be described from the user's viewpoint. We use a scenario when we need to know what actions the user is taking with the system and what problems they might be encountering. Scenarios are useful in validating the system requirements and creating test cases. The test cases are, looking back at our login page example, the test cases would be the 3 different outcomes the user could have run into by logging into our login page, like not remembering his password or invalid credentials or successfully logging in. Scenarios can be useful for almost any system. If we are looking for more data instead of observation, scenarios might not be our best option. So now that we've learned all this, how can we use scenarios for our home teaching application that we're using for this class? So every user interactive part of our application should be tested with scenarios. It helps us understand bugs, it helps us understand what the user's seeing, and just helps us get a better understanding of how someone who didn't create the application would perceive our application. So for the project we're working on this semester, we could have a user sit and go through a couple different features of our application. First, we could have the user create an account, see how that goes. Second, we could have the user enter their schedule and other data into the application and see if they have any problems doing that or if it goes the way we anticipate. 3, we could have the user look to see if they can see the visiting or home teaching partner they were assigned, or if there's a flaw in our system and they can't see it, or maybe they were assigned a teacher that doesn't even match up with their schedule. That would help us see if there's a problem in our code. Or 4th, we could have the user go through and report whether they were visit taught or not. Does that function work the way we were anticipating? As the application is created, there may be more scenarios we find that would be helpful to test with the user that maybe we didn't think of right away because we didn't know all the functionality of our application when we started. All these different scenarios that we're testing will also help us understand if some part of the user application interaction is too difficult and cannot easily be completed by a non-technical user. These scenarios will also help us find any bugs there may be in the software and just any design changes or helpful hints we may need to add to be more user-friendly.